Alright, thank you for that little break. Now I'm using a Kindle version of this book on bumper sticker ethics, so I'll be giving you locations. Sadly they don't always give page numbers, but what I'll do is try to give you some idea of where it is. This is still in the first chapter. It's at location 114, and he says, in ethics, right means something different than correct. Correct is the label we attach to information that is factually true, while right is oriented toward moral truth. Now I know we let those words, is that the correct behavior? Is that the right facts? I know we use these words interchangeably, but he's trying to just make a distinction here that we don't exactly mean the same thing by the terms. To talk about a moral, whether something is morally right, or to use the word right, let me say it this way. In our own thinking, we have to be able to make a distinction between the difference between something that's simply correct or is factual and something that is a moral judgment. And correct and right are the terms that he's suggesting that we use to keep those things clear. I think that's fairly consistent and is a good practice to use, but the bigger point is to recognize that they aren't the same thing. And in fact, when we come to the distinction between is and ought, here in a few minutes it'll become more important. Now, Theory 1, starting in on Chapter 2, is called When in Rome, Do as the Romans. Now that's an interesting theory here, isn't it? Interesting way to put the theory. But what he has in mind, of course, is cultural relativism, as he says here underneath. How do you deal with the fact that different people in different cultures come to very different moral judgments? In fact, even within the Christian family that's the case, right? I mean, some of our biggest disputes amongst different traditions, or even within the same tradition, have to do with how we come to the judgment that a particular behavior is morally right or morally wrong. One of the ways to deal with that is with relativism, the position that he calls relativism here, and it's at the bottom of like the second or third page of the chapter, just under cultural relativism, that heading. Ethical relativism, the belief that there is no moral truth that applies to all people at all times, has been around for a long time. So what he's suggesting here, and what the whole idea of cultural relativism is that because we cannot come to agreement on an overarching moral standard, then the best we can do is sort of let each tribe, if you will, have its own judgments about what's morally right and what's morally wrong. There are, I think, a couple of different ways to articulate this, and it's important to make the distinction. There are those who are relativists, who simply are relativists because they believe there are no moral absolutes, and that morality is a human construct that we've created in order to structure and organize our lives. Chaos doesn't make much sense, and so we just have to, perhaps arbitrarily, perhaps not, make some judgments about what things we're going to call right and what things we're going to call wrong, if for no other reason than to help us structure our living together in peaceful ways. On the other hand, there are those who would say, well, there is an absolute moral standard, it's just that we don't know what it is, or at best we have only glimpses of what it is, and as a consequence of that, rather than insisting that we got it all right, that we need to leave space for people to disagree about what constitutes moral behavior and what constitutes immoral behavior. I mean, just to give an example of how this plays itself out in everyday life, a couple pages later, location 286, he says, if you've grown up in a Western culture, you probably believe that Western ways of seeing the world are correct. We just take it for granted that our own way of seeing the world is right. It's what we've known from our youth up. In fact, I often say when I'm teaching mission courses that the single biggest challenge that we as Christians have when we engage in mission activity is to separate what it means to be an American from what it means to be a Christian, because we have so entangled those two things, or even Westerners, that to be a Westerner is somehow more consistent with being a Christian, or is consistent. I mean, in the worst cases, it's like being an American and being a Christian are the same thing. And so what he's talking about here is in whatever culture we grow up in, we just normally come to accept our culture as being correct. We'll go into the critiques, not here in the discussion, because I'd be lecturing for hours if we went into that level of detail on each one. So I'm just going to do the briefest introduction of each of these and then leave the discussion of the different points for the discussion center. Alright, the next one, theory 2, is ethical egoism, or look out for number one. How many of us have heard that? That the idea of the number one priority that we have is to care for ourselves. And perhaps we sometimes extend that just a little further. As long as I protect me and my family, then I'll do whatever I have to do. It will be morally acceptable. He cites the philosopher Ayn Rand in some of his work here. In fact, he talks about her a good deal because she's the one who I think has tried to resuscitate or give credence to this as an acceptable, not only acceptable, but the right theory about what constitutes moral behaviors. She in fact rejects altruism. Altruism is the belief that we should act in ways that are good for others as well as for ourselves. We can actually make sacrifices of ourselves in the good of others. Now, different ways of making judgments about when you do that and when you don't, of course, but self-sacrifice to her was a silly idea. It's interesting that she tries to give credence to her system by calling it objectivism. That is, we're just observing the way things really are. In fact, what she'll say is that this is pretty much how we always act, and that what we do is we develop moral and ethical systems that build justifications in for our acting in our interest, in our self-interest. And she says, well, let's just get rid of those. Let's just admit that we act on self-interest, and let's glorify that and make that the moral standard. Now, of course, there are complications that come along. If everybody looked like they were simply acting in their own best interest, then we would all be perceived as selfish, and we would be pretty untrusting of each other, I think. It was interesting that in the Republic, there's a character in the Republic by Plato, there's a character whose name is Thrasymachus, and he says the best way of acting is to, if I can adjust what he said for this particular situation, is that we act like we care about the interests of others, but we're really only self-interested. I don't think it's quite that crass in what she's saying, but it is what I'm reminded of as I read through some of the commentary here. Now, recognize that when Rand defends the notion of acting in accord with our self-interest, she doesn't just mean, okay, acting in accord for my best interest for today. She believes that we're able to rationally plan things out, and that we should act in our long-term best interest. It may be the case that something we do today looks like it isn't in our best interest, but really it's in our longer-term best interest, and that's the sense in which it's meant. And often the phrase used to describe that is enlightened self-interest. It has a strong confidence that if we just act that way, that will give us the best outcomes that we could possibly get. Again, I want to hear about your critiques in the discussion center. Theory 3, I couldn't help it, or I couldn't help myself. Give me a second to get to the beginning of that chapter. Nice thing about Kindles is you can do a lot of searching. One of the bad things about it is it's hard to put little yellow stickies on pages to let you flip through them faster. Alright, so the idea I couldn't help myself, the idea here is that what human beings do is actually determined, predetermined. We aren't free. The appearance of freedom is an illusion. The freedom we feel and defend isn't really the nature, our nature at all. In fact, it's a form of determinism that we normally call scientific determinism. All things that happen have antecedent causes connected to them. And so if you were to ask why I chose to have a glass of orange juice this morning, it isn't because I really chose to have a glass of orange juice. It's because there was a whole string of causal factors, presumably all the way back to the beginning, that have played themselves out in ways that lead me to want a glass of orange juice for this morning. So really this one is not so much an ethical theory about what makes things right or wrong as it is a statement that there really isn't such a thing as ethics, not in any meaningful, deep sense of the word, because we are predetermined. Now it raises questions in location 687. He makes this, Skinner's the guy that he's quoting, and he says, Skinner wrote a novel entitled Walden 2, in which he outlined his vision for a utopian community. In this community, behavior is modified by controlling the input to the inhabitants. But of course the question you have to ask yourself is, if all of that controlling of inputs is also caused by things that have already come before, how is it that we ever actually are able to make any of those sorts of judgments? The point though here is, since we can't choose, we can't get from, remember I made the distinction between is and ought a few minutes ago? We can't get from is, this is what humans do, to this is what humans do, because there isn't free will to connect those things. You see, we can make factual statements about what people do based on how they're determined, but we can't make moral judgments because we aren't really free to make those kinds of judgments. Again, it's not so much an ethical theory as it is an explanation of behaviors. The next one, chapter 5, theory 4, survival of the fittest, is of course rooted in Darwinian evolution. In location 885, this is right into chapter 5. He's talking about how in Darwin's Origin of the Species there were sort of these behavioralists, that is, things caused along the lines Skinner talks about, these caused behaviors in humans that were precursors to human moral behaviors. Here's what he says. Everyone who has seen how jealous a dog is of his master's affection if lavished on another creature, and I have observed the same fact with monkeys. This shows that animals not only love, but have a desire to be loved. And then the quote stops. Antecedents for human moral qualities, such as love, honesty, cooperation, and faithfulness to kin, are all found in the social behaviors of the animal world. Now, evolution, at least this social Darwinianism, sort of fell out of favor before World War I, or around the time of World War I, and that's because the optimism, I mean, you know, if you think social Darwinianism is true and there's the survival of the fittest notion, then what you think is that over time things ought to be getting better. And so progressive theories about the human nature were very popular. However, with the atrocities and the horrors of World War I, we came to see that we were still, in fact, a fallen creature, and that, in fact, we could be pretty destructive. And so this idea that we were on the shining path toward better things fell out of popularity. Then the whole notion of genetics arose, and now the theories of I couldn't help myself or survival of the fittest really get more connected to genetical theories. Now again, as the previous one, it's not so much a theory of moral action as it is an explanation for why we do the things that we do. In location 993, oh sorry, 933. The predominant quality, this is the beginning of a chapter before the break that says how genes became moral. The predominant quality that allows DNA to make the evolutionary cut is, as Dawkins puts it, ruthless selfishness, an attribute that will usually give rise to selfishness in individual behavior. So what is it what is the goal of the human gene or the gene of any animal? Well, it's just to survive, for its species to survive. Later on, he talks about how the idea of God could have evolved. It could have evolved in the course of our going from whatever state we were in to where we are now. Some evolutionary, this is on location 976, some evolutionary ethicists have suggested that consciousness came at a cost. Human beings, driven by a will to live, were now also conscious of their mortality. This awareness led to despair, which presented a danger to our survival-oriented genome. Epigenetic rules created religion as a response to this threat. Since religion gives purpose to life by conferring meaning on our existence, it has survival value. So what is the role of religion? It's just to give us hope, so that we don't despair and give up in the in view of our pending death, our mortality. The promise of something beyond then gives us reason to continue. Again, I'm not going to do much by the way of critique at this point, but save that for the discussion. But this is the third or fourth of the theories that he's discussed in these first 6 chapters, and now we're on to the last one. As I said earlier, we could spend the whole semester talking, I think, about just this one book. We could very easily spend a week on each of these theories, but we're going to cover them quickly, so be ready to ask whatever questions you have as they come up. The beginning of chapter 6, utilitarianism, the greatest happiness. The idea here is not just simple egoism, that is, I want to do whatever makes me happy, but it involves a calculus. What behaviors result in the most happiness for the most people? So it's not just about immediate feeling and pleasure, if you will. It's a more robust, longer-term sense of goodness. In fact, Aristotle used the term eudaimonia. What is the goal of life? Eudaimonia. It was a deep sense of happiness at all levels, not just a feel good in the sense of physical pleasure, but it involved all aspects of our existence, intellectual, musical. It did include physical too, so we don't do things that cause us pain and so on. And it includes altruism. In fact, people can behave in ways that are self-sacrificial. And at a location 1123, we note here, thus it's a paragraph that starts, 2 things are involved, and it's at the bottom of that. Thus, utilitarianism is an altruistic approach to the extent that whenever the majority will receive greater happiness, you have an obligation to honor its decisions, even if it's not to your advantage. So the idea, the greatest good for the most, doesn't necessarily mean that will be your greatest good in a particular situation. And that's why altruism then actually becomes an obligation. If the moral principle is the most happiness for the most people, then if you see that some self-sacrifice results in more happiness to others, then you're obliged to act in that way. You can defend this as theistic, that is, God wills our long-term flourishing, and so the idea that we should pursue the greatest good for the greatest number is consistent, folks would say. It also has both qualitative and quantitative versions. That is, the question that comes up is, well, are we talking about, when we say the most pleasure, some pleasures are more deep than others. So can you just say, well, this one pleasure and this one pleasure, we just add them up? Well, the qualitative version says, no, you have to take into account the kind of pleasure that it is, and the deepest sorts of pleasure, and Wilkins goes into that in some detail. The quantitative theorists, though, are more about what is the most good that we can have, and the reason that they tend to be quantitative is not because they're crass, but because the question of how you make judgments about what counts as quality can get really complicated. Okay, that covers the theories that I wanted to discuss for this week. Next week we'll pick up with a number of others. As I said, some of these are more explanations of behavior than they are theories of moral right and wrong. But I'll look forward to your discussions. I will post questions. This should be up on Monday. I'll post questions on Tuesday, and I'll look forward to your responses. Looking forward to this semester with you.